I want to go back to my student experience back when I was studying philosophy. So maybe that's a sign of age that you start with these reminiscing things. But in any case, I don't know how you felt back then when you had classes where people were talking about meaning. And then gradually you found out that there are lots and lots and lots of philosophical theories of meaning around throughout the history of philosophy. And I can remember very well when I was a student that I found this pretty bewildering. And to some extent I still do, but what I want to do in my talk today is I want to put some order, okay, so introduce some order into this bewildering mess, okay? And we'll see whether you like the kind of order that I come up with. At least I thought it helped me a little bit better to understand what's going on there. Okay, and the main order that I want to introduce to these philosophical theories of meaning is that I want to suggest that philosophers have been dealing with two kinds of meaning. One of which I want to call semantic meaning, and the other one I want to call pragmatic meaning. Maybe these are not the best of all terms because, well, we've been using these terms semantic. If you don't like the terms ultimately, fair enough, maybe you have a better suggestion. But it's important for me that there will be these two kinds of meanings. And I want to suggest that whether you come from the more philosophical / logical rational reconstruction side to the topic of meaning, or whether you come from the more descriptive empirical side, the linguistic side to meaning, you should be interested in explicating both kinds of meaning and investigating how they relate to each other. And that's what I want to do in this talk. And I'll first tell you a bit more what I have in mind when I want to distinguish semantic and pragmatic meaning. And then I'll focus on what I call pragmatic meaning and give you a little toy example, which I call communicative belief revision. Actually, in many ways, this will be close to what Frank told us about in his talk. And then I'll present what you might call a research program. And it's a kind of decision theoretic explication of what pragmatic meaning might be. And then ultimately we will find out whether it's a good, successful research program or not. But fortunately, we won't find that out today. Okay? And then I'll draw some general conclusions on that. So let me just strengthen here the point that I come from the rational reconstruction side to things. Okay? So I'm not coming from the linguistic side. So what I have in mind here is when you're interested in the topic of meaning, truth, and the like, then you might have the original intention that I think Tarski had or someone like Carnap had. Okay? So you take something that's there in a kind of intuitive form, and then you want to clarify it and to make it more precise and make it more systematic and make it more consistent. Okay? So you build up something that is like the thing that you started from, but it's only similar to that, but it's the better version of what you started from. Okay? So you take the intuitive notion of truth as we have it in ordinary language, and then if you're Tarski, you explicate it, okay? And you turn it into something that's clearer and sharper and more systematic and more consistent. Think of the liar paradox, and so on and so forth. Okay? And then to the extent to which the original thing proves to be fine, you just leave it as it is. To the extent to which the original thing is not fine, think of paradoxes. Okay? You want to replace it by the better thing that you have constructed. Okay? That's the rational reconstruction business. It's a normative business. Okay? It's typically what you find, I think, traditionally in philosophical logic. Okay? And that's sort of where I come from. But then there's the other side, where you can approach topics like meaning, truth, language as a whole, from the empirical side, as an empirical scientist. Okay? And that's how I still think that's what I still think of people are doing in linguistics, or should be doing in linguistics. Okay? It's an empirical matter. Okay? So there you don't want to improve the phenomenon, you just want to describe, explain, predict the phenomenon as it is. Okay? And that's a different aim. Okay? As I said, I'm coming from the first one rather than the second one. And this will show up, I think, in many ways later in my talk. But then again, there's enough overlap between the two. They share methods, and they, there can be a fruitful feedback process between the two of them as we have it. Of course, from Tarski and Carnap and so on, intentional models derived, right? And then ultimately they become really important in semantics as done by linguists, as we all know, and this is the kind of back and forth process. Okay, so as I said, I want to distinguish two kinds of meaning. The first one, I take it is rather unproblematic to explain. It's basically semantic meaning in the sense of truth conditions. If the linguistic items for the time being are simply declarative sentences, okay? Ultimately, we want to have more than that, but paradigmatically, you think of declarative sentences that are truth conditions, that's their semantic meaning, okay? So it's a constraint that the sentence imposes on the world, what the world has to be like in order for the sentence to be true. It's the truth conditions. And then there's the other thing, which I want to call pragmatic meaning. Very often people talk like it's the pragmatic meaning of, say, a declarative sentence, but in many ways it's rather the pragmatic meaning of a speech act involving that declarative sentence, okay? Where it's clear from the context, you can then forget about the speech act. And that I want to think of not as a constraint that the sentence imposes on the world, but on an agent's actions, okay? Where action needs to be understood very, very broadly, okay? So it's not truth conditions of a sentence, it's rather permissibility conditions of a sentence. It's what the sentence or a speech act involving the sentence permits, okay? And that's what I want to call the pragmatic meaning of A. And in that camp, you find lots of these instances of this bewildering variety of theories of meaning, and I want to put them into the same box, okay? Now it's good that, many people who originally are, had to be found in this box, many decades ago, are not in this room, because they don't want to be maybe in the same box, okay? They would throw stuff at me and all of that, okay? But I want to claim it makes good sense. You want to put things in order by putting them into the same box, okay? So there's pragmatism, and I'll return to that on the next slide. There's this Wittgensteinian view of meaning as use and language games, okay? I want to think of this school of thought as dealing with pragmatic meaning, okay? And that will show up later in my talk. Intuitionists, so that's in foundations of mathematics and logic. Think of the Brouwer-Heiting-Kolmogorov semantics, okay, for mathematical statements, okay. So what happens there is you associate with a sentence a proof, okay, maybe a canonical proof, maybe a set of proofs, something like that, okay. And you should think of that as a kind of an action, okay, that leads to ultimately that sentence A being demonstrated, okay. And then you build up proofs for complex sentences, right? You explain what a proof is for a complex sentence by explaining what a proof is of the parts of the sentence and how they are combined, okay? So here, the acts in question are acts of proof or, more generally, maybe of construction, okay? But it's a similar idea, pragmatic meaning, okay? Think good old verificationism, okay? There the meaning of a declarative sentence was meant to be the method or the methods of verifying the sentence. Okay? And these verifications, how you verify a sentence, that's an action again. Okay? So I think they belong to the same group. Proof theoretic semantics. Okay? Say you're a logical inferentialist. Okay? Then the idea is the actions that you're interested in are inferences. Okay? Inferences that can be determined from rules, right? Maybe introduction and elimination rules in natural deduction, something like that. Okay? And then if you're a logical inferentialist, you think that the meaning of the logical constant is somehow constituted by these rules, okay? And these rules, as I said, they guide the actions, the inference steps, okay? So I would put them into the same camp. Game theoretic semantics, dynamic semantics, update semantics, okay? So we've just heard talk on update semantics. What happens there, and Frank nicely described it at the beginning of his talk, is you associate with a sentence roughly what the sentence does to a certain state, and then you interpret that as a belief state or a context state. What the sentence or asserting the sentence does to such a state, how it changes that kind of thing. Okay? That means you associate with a sentence an action or a set of actions. Okay? So I think it belongs into the same camp. Expressivist semantics, probabilistic semantics, if you think of conceptual role semantics as Hartley Field once developed it, okay? Belongs to the same camp. Conceptual space semantics, so that's Peter Gardenforth, and so on and so forth. So I think all of them, what they have in common, they differ in lots of ways. Okay, that's why they maybe don't want to be put into the same camp. But what they all have in common is, okay, they try to explain meaning by constraints that a sentence or a speech act involving a sentence imposes on actions of different kinds. Okay, and that's why I want to put them into the same group. So it's really like this. This is a constraint on words, semantic meaning. This is a constraint on actions, okay? Some words are in, some words are out, some actions are in, some actions are out, okay? This constraint is a kind of normative constraint, okay? So the sentence permits an action, okay? You don't find the same normativity here, so for different kinds. Okay, so here's a classic example. So history of philosophy, Charles Sanders Peirce on the pragmatic maxim. Okay, so that's classic American pragmatism, okay? And there the idea is, how do you specify what meaning is? Well, there is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference in practice, okay? A possible difference in practice, okay? That's exactly what I have in mind, okay? So pragmatism is one of the most famous incarnations of that understanding of meaning. You can also see possible differences in practice, so it's not just you look at the actual effects, as it were, right, but rather the potential effects, okay? So very often, this second group of meaning theorists, they would involve dispositional states, okay? You're disposed to act in a particular way under particular circumstances, okay? That's also why many pragmatists and many others in this camp would look at belief, because belief seems to be a kind of dispositional state, okay? And it's paradigmatically a state that would lead to action, given some desires or the like, okay? So that's very often what you find in this camp is people asserting a sentence has on the belief state of an agent, okay? And that's roughly how Frank, for example, explained today, update semantics in one possible way. But then again, I'm from Austria, we're neutral, okay? So I want to think of, there being semantic meaning and pragmatic meaning at the same time, and what I'm personally really interested in is how they relate to each other. Okay, so I want to acknowledge the existence of both of them, I want to keep them conceptually apart, and then I want to study how they relate to each other. Okay? And if you look at belief, that gives, I think, a clear indication that that should be the right way to go. Okay? Because it seems to me, at least that's what the tradition would say, belief has both of these aspects. Belief as representation, that's when people say in the philosophy of mind, beliefs aim at the truth. Okay? That's sort of on the semantic meaning side, as it were. Okay? But then again, beliefs are also dispositions to act, right? So that's on the, as it were, pragmatic meaning side. Okay? And beliefs are both at the same time. Okay? By this, I do not want to say that ultimately semantic meaning and pragmatic meaning will be the same. Okay? Even for belief, right? Belief as a representation, that's when you look at the contents of beliefs, okay? So a belief is true just in case its propositional content is true, okay? So that's where it comes from, okay? Whereas belief as disposition to act, that's when you have to look at the attitude rather than the content primarily, okay? So there's a difference here. Ultimately, semantic meaning and pragmatic meaning will be different, okay? But I want to acknowledge the existence of both of them, and just as it's the case for the phenomenon of belief, I want to study how you can have the two of them together, okay? As it is the case with belief. Okay? Similarly, say you do not want to talk about all or nothing belief, categorical belief, but rather degrees of belief, okay? Maybe subjective probabilities, okay? Like we had today in Robert's talk, maybe, if you interpret them subjectively, okay? Then you have the same thought, right? These days, if philosophers want to justify the axioms of subjective probability, there are two ways of doing it, right? One is an epistemic justification, okay? So that's the aiming at the truth part. Okay, you can show very roughly, if you don't distribute your degrees of belief according to the axioms of probability, then there would be a way for you to get closer to the truth. Okay, and that way of getting closer to the truth would satisfy the axioms of subjective probability. Okay, but then there's also a pragmatic justification. Okay, and that's the Dutch book arguments, the decision theoretic arguments, and so on. Okay, but ultimately both of them justify, the same axioms, the axioms of subjective probability. Okay? That's the picture that I want to advertise, and the distinction between semantic and pragmatic meaning is a kind of linguistic counterpart to that. Okay? Similarly, there's a similar story to be told about the contents. Primarily, propositions should be something like representations. Okay? There are these abstract entities that are true or false. But then again, there's the alternative view, like Soames has it, of thinking of propositions as actions. Okay? And that's roughly what you get if you look at propositions from the viewpoint of the propositions being contents of beliefs that then correspond to dispositions to act under certain circumstances. Okay? Collect these actions, then they're sort of the action theoretic counterpart of what the proposition is. Okay? So you can, but the important thing is you have both of them at the same time. Okay, so how do these kinds of meaning relate to each other, semantic and pragmatic meaning? Well, there are suggestions in that literature. Again, I'm looking just at the pragmatist literature. as something called Ramsey's principle that you find in a nice book by Dokic and Angel. So that's Ramsey. Essence of pragmatism, I take to be this, that the meaning of a sentence is to be defined by reference to the actions to which asserting it would lead. Clearly, pragmatic meaning. Yeah? And then he would say very roughly, I'll cut that short, ultimately truth should correspond to being useful, okay? And as you can imagine, you know, it can't be that simple, okay? Can't be that simple, okay? And this was pretty clear early on, right? There must be a bridge ultimately between semantic and pragmatic meaning that's to do with truth on the one hand and practical success on the other one, okay? But it can't just be that a sentence, a declarative sentence is true just in case it is useful or believing it to be true is useful or so. That's too simple-minded, okay? And very early on, already Russell was criticizing that kind of view. That won't fly, okay? Then the reason being that truth is a local property of a proposition or a sentence expressing the proposition or of a belief with that proposition as its content. It's a local thing. Whereas usefulness, okay, practical success is a kind of holistic thing, okay? It's like, take the comparison with philosophy of science, right? So we would say a theory can be true or false, sure. Certain axiom of a theory can be true or false, okay? But it's the theory as a whole that gets confirmed, right? That's confirmational holism, the standard story goes, okay? And being well confirmed as a whole, right, that means being scientifically successful, okay? And people would say it's not just this particular axiom that's confirmed, it's the theory as a whole, okay? So this is the kind of holism that you get on the success side. And that is why it's not that easy, as Ramsey makes it sound here in these quotes, to build this bridge between truth and success, okay? So we'll have to build more indirect bridges, ultimately. And some of these bridges will show up later, okay? Okay, now, but let me make things formally more precise first. So I don't have to do that for semantic meaning. That should be pretty clear, okay? So since Tarski and Carnap and Montague and, you know, all of the heroes from the semantic camp, okay? And as I said, you know, I'm Austrian. I'm appreciating that kind of tradition, okay? And I want to keep it on board, okay? That's different from, you know, say someone like Dummett, who is on this pragmatic meaning side and maybe wants to kick away this kind of truth conditional business, okay? And others, say Wittgenstein, say, and so on. That's not what I'm advocating, okay? I want to keep that in place. But we all know how to do that. It's less clear on the pragmatic meaning side, okay? It's less clear on the pragmatic meaning side. So let me tell you how I would like to make that precise, but then again, I'm borrowing lots of stuff that's existing anyway, and I've already mentioned some of these sources before. So I want to make pragmatic meaning more precise by thinking of it as determining a linguistic game, okay? So we're playing a game. That's the Wittgenstein game metaphor, if you like, okay? So it's a game of scores. That's the states of the game, okay? So the score captures everything that's relevant to the current state of the game at the time, roughly speaking, okay? You put everything there that's important. And then there are moves, so actions in the game, by which you can move from one score to another one, okay? But when you're at a score, there might be more than one permissible move, okay? So I see Jan in the audience, okay? As a chess player, it's pretty clear what that would mean, okay? So there are, at some point during the chess game, different moves available to you that are all permissible. Others are not, okay? That's the kind of picture. So it's like a game, but it's a linguistic game, okay? And the linguistic game, as I will understand it, consists of a domain of scores. So it's basically, you have some tuples available, okay, a space of tuples, and in the tuple you specify everything that's important for telling you where you are in the game. And then you have rules that determine which moves are permissible, and hence commitment changing, okay, and which are not, okay. And the commitment we heard something about today, so this could be social commitment, this could be personal commitment, you know, anything goes. Now, what I want to borrow from proof theoretic semantics is the idea that there are different kinds of rules, introduction and elimination rules, okay? More generally, you might say there are output rules and input rules, okay? And what I have in mind here is you are at a particular state in the game, a score, then a rule might specify which speech acts are now permissible for you to undertake, okay? And they might involve a sentence A, maybe a declarative one, okay? And that's an output rule because you're in the state, or, you know, part of it maybe, if part of the tuple belongs to your own state. And then this output rule allows you to output a particular speech act, maybe the assertion of a declarative sentence. Okay? But then there are input rules, like elimination rules, that work the other way around. So there is a speech act. Someone asserts something. Okay? And then the input rule tells you which moves are allowed for you to change your score or your part of the score. Okay? So that's the same idea like an introduction elimination rule, but just a bit generalized. And then there will be structural rules, okay? There's always a score that's the actual one, okay? And when you move, then, you know, this is maybe no longer actual, but the new score is actual, okay? And there are only moves that are available to you, but maybe not to someone else, and so on and so forth, okay? But I'll just leave them implicit. So we can then design such games, okay? And now there are certain choice points that you find in the literature on how to design such games. For example, an important question is pragmatic meaning compositional or not? Okay? And people have very differing opinions in this class, in this pragmatic meaning camp that I've outlined before, okay? So the question is, are the permissible moves for a sentence A determined compositionally from the permissible moves for sub-expressions of A and how these sub-expressions are put together? That's the question, okay? And someone like, say, Wittgenstein would say, no, compositionality doesn't play a role, okay? No. Others, like intuitionists, dynamic semantics, probabilistic semantics, okay? That's a recent paper in Semantics and Pragmatics by Sarah Moss, okay? In this probabilistic semantics, well, the answer is yes, it's compositional, okay? So you have a choice point, how to design the game here, okay? The second important choice point is, may pragmatic meaning presuppose semantic meaning? That is, may the game rules for A, which will ultimately constitute a pragmatic meaning, may they refer to the semantic meaning of A? Okay? And again, people differ here. So proof-theoretic semantics would like to say no. They want to steer clear of that. Okay? They want to give a pure sort of pragmatic meaning story, ultimately. Right? But in other cases, maybe dynamic semantics, you know, they would be happy, okay, for some of these rules to actually refer truth conditions, okay, maybe as presuppositions of certain actions or the like. Okay? So this differs. Okay, let me give you a little toy example, and then you'll see how I make these choices in my toy example. So I will design a simple game of asserting and supposing, okay? It's restricted for the time being to declarative sentences and their semantic contents, okay? So the only acts available will be acts of assertion and supposition, okay? I'll take on board that a semantics is in place. Just think of a standard Tarskian or maybe intentional semantics, okay? So in particular, the semantic meaning of a declarative sentence will be a proposition, and a proposition is a set of worlds given in a space of worlds, okay? Just as usual. And the object language, let that be very simple, propositional language, finitely many propositional letters, no introspective modalities, as simple as can be. Okay? And then what are the scores? Let's assume the scores are looking like this. Okay? So there is a CG component by which I denote the common ground of discourse. Okay? So ultimately, this will be about assertion and supposition, as I said, and there will be a common ground between those that are engaging in this kind of conversation. Okay? So that's the standard Stolnikarian notion of a common ground, what's presupposed in the discourse in that context, okay? So initially, maybe you put into the common ground just a set of all worlds, and then later on, additional propositions are thrown into the common ground. You can always take the intersection then, okay? That's roughly what people presuppose at this point in time. The other ingredients in the score are simply the beliefs that the different agents have, say, for simplicity, okay? The agents that are having a conversation. These beliefs I think of as being conditional beliefs. So it's something like the qualitative counterpart of conditional probability. Okay? So an agent I can have, if she is in that state, a conditional belief in Y given X, where Y and X are propositions to be expressed by declarative sentences. Okay? And what is a conditional belief? It just means that if this is the case, then the agent believes Y on the supposition of X. So it's like the conditional probability of Y given X. It's just not numerical. It's all or nothing. Okay? But other than that, you know, think of something like conditional proofs. You assume something, and under that assumption, you draw some conclusions. Okay, that's the Y. We need to come up with a kind of formal model for that, for these conditional beliefs. Otherwise, we don't know what these score components are. Okay? So I just go with the orthodoxy here. So I invoke the standard theory of HEM belief revision. Okay? So it's been around since the 80s, and you can think of that as a formal model of what the conditional beliefs of a rational agent must be like. Okay? So instead of saying the agent I believes Y on the supposition of X, you can also say in the current belief state, if that was revised by X, the supposition, then she would end up believing Y. And then you would use in terminology more like belief revision people in formal epistemology would use. Okay? Now, this is the belief revision operator. The formal details at present are not that important. The belief revision people, they do not so much speak about propositions normally, but rather about sentences or sets of sentences, sort of the linguistic counterparts of propositions, okay? And then you get what's called the LEITGEB axioms, 8 of them, and they pin down sort of rationality postulates for how rational belief revision is going to take place, okay? So for example, if you suppose something that's consistent with what you currently believe, then what you do more or less is you throw in what you suppose, you close deductively, and that's what you end up believing under the supposition, right? The more interesting case is what if you suppose something that contradicts something that you have to believe, then you have to make room for the supposition. This can be done in different ways, but all of these ways are subject to these actions that you find here, okay? Now, it's well known for a long time that on the I want to say semantic side, but keep in mind we're on track for pragmatic meaning, okay? On the semantic, on the possible world modeling side, okay? These LEITGEB postulates correspond to a kind of sphere system, as Lewis once had it for his semantics of counterfactuals, or a total pre-ordering of worlds. So you order worlds maybe according to their plausibility, and it's a pre-order in the sense that worlds can be tied, they can be equally plausible, okay? So this is a set of worlds, say, what the agent currently believes is the set of formulas that are true in all of them, okay, that's K, and then E is supposed, okay, so here, this is E would contradict K, right? There is no world that simultaneously satisfies K and E, okay? So what's been going on is if you're an LEITGEB belief reviser, what you do is you get to the closest world, sort of closest to K, to the closest worlds that satisfy E. So this will be a new belief set after revision. That's K star E here, okay? So it's like in the semantics for counterfactuals that you find in David Lewis, okay? Or if you think like people in non-monotonic reasoning would think, that looks a lot like Frank's models before, okay? That's what you currently believe, okay? You suppose E, what you do after the supposition is, you believe what's true in all the most plausible worlds that satisfy the evidence or the supposition, okay?
What if K is the whole square already?
If K is the whole square, that would be a set of all worlds, then you update by the trivial information, nothing's going to happen. Because if you update with the square, then the most plausible worlds will be just the worlds that are in the layer down here, and that's what you originally believed, that's K. Okay? So K star trivial information is K, and that just follows from the LEITGEB postulate. Okay? So that's the formal framework that I'm using. If you want to iterate belief revision, more needs to be done, but for what I'm going to speak about, I don't need that. Okay? And now I introduce my rules. So now you know my scores, right? So we have different agents. They have this kind of ordering of worlds, each of them. And now we need rules, and here are my rules, okay? Introduction rules, output rules, and elimination rules, input rules, okay? And then I only have these speech checks of assertion and supposition for simplicity, and it's very simple. It says, so under certain circumstances, an agent I is allowed to assert A, okay? To engage in that kind of speech check. When is this permissible? Well, first of all, this sentence must express a proposition X. That's where the semantics is presupposed, okay? So expresses means semantically expresses, okay? A expresses the proposition X semantically. And then the agent believes X, given everything that's presupposed currently, where this is the common ground, okay? So on the supposition of the common ground, the agent believes X, okay? Then she's permitted to assert A. Okay, so basically you take on board what's currently the common ground, you check what you believe, you express what you believe by a sentence, that you are allowed to assert. Okay, very simple rule. Okay. And for supposition, what you can do is, as long as it's sort of not logically false, say, you can always publicly suppose a sentence, okay, and thereby try to add something to the common ground. Okay, and that you can do freely, other than for purely logical considerations. And on the elimination side, if something is asserted, right, then you're permitted, that's an agent J now, not necessarily the one who asserted, right, A. An agent J is allowed to take that on board and to update or to revise her beliefs, given what was asserted. Okay, and there I use the belief revision operator. And if something is publicly supposed, then it's permitted to take that and throw it into the common ground. Okay? So these are the rules. Okay, so you can see rules that have effects on you and rules that tell you what you're allowed to do, okay, given a certain state. So here's an example. Yeah. Sure.
So elimination is permitted. You said it's permitted to add.
It's permitted. It's not required. Yeah. You also, yes. So in principle, you could sort of leave the discussion, as it were. Yeah, I don't want to take the supposition on board. Right? So you say to me, suppose A, and I just say, I'm sorry, I need to leave. Okay? Don't want to engage in that. And I wouldn't do it out of politeness, but this is not a linguistic rule. Okay? So that's the idea. It's always permissible moves. Okay?
And it's okay with you that there's like a default accommodation if I don't opt out?
That was, yes, but there's no complex story of accommodation like you would have it in Lewis and scorekeeping. So, you know, all of this can be added, but I just want to keep it simple. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So here's a little example. Two people, okay? That's subject 1's belief state, that's subject 2's belief state. You see the ordering of worlds. For example, subject 1 believes that P, right? Because the most plausible worlds for them are P worlds, okay? All of them, okay? Whereas this subject here, subject 2, she believes Q, right? So that's how this goes. And now here's a move that's allowed. Subject 1 is allowed to assert P, okay? Because that's what she believes, okay? Nothing going on with supposition so far, right? And in this little example, supposition won't be used, okay? So these are the P worlds here, okay? Now what the second agent does is she revises on that information, right? So she takes the most plausible worlds within the given information, and that's this one here, okay? So that's K2 revised in the sense of 2 by the information K1 that was given, namely P, to her, okay? So what she can now do is, she's allowed to assert in the other direction, as it were, okay, P and Q, because that's what she ended up believing, okay, under the information that was given to her, okay? And the agent 1 here might update or revise on that. So here you get K1 revised in the sense of 1 by K2 revised in the sense of 2 by K1. I could introduce parentheses if you prefer, okay? So this is a little dialogue that we've just watched going on here, okay? And all of these moves were permitted by the game. That's the idea, yeah? Very simple. Okay, sure.
If one agent asserts the other must revise, can one reject the assertion?
It can, as I said, so it's, so.
That's not in the game somehow. No.
Well, this just means it's permissible. So she can make the move. So you tell me something, I could just say, no, I don't, you know, I don't trust you. No, I don't.
More than reject.
That's another possibility. It's not in the game. I don't have a speech check of rejection here, right? At best, I have the assertion of the negation, and then we would check whether this is permitted or not, okay? But I don't need to take the move at the very least, okay? Yeah? As I said, it's a very simple game, but you know. Okay, so let me just focus on 4 specific ways of playing this little game here, okay? The one is, 1 asserts her total belief, 2 revises and asserts her total belief, and 1 revises, end of game. So, okay, you start with 1, you have 2, you have 1, end of story, okay? Second kind of game, someone says suppose A, doesn't really matter who. Someone says suppose A, so this is added, the proposition A expresses is added to the common ground. 1 asserts a total belief, under that supposition, right? 2 revises and asserts what she believes, under the supposition, 1 revises. So it's again 2, 1, 2. Okay? Second kind of play. And then you just reverse roles, okay? Sort of 2 starts. So you get 2, 1, 2 rather than 1, 2, 1, okay? So these are 4 kinds of games, and I just want to focus on them. Okay? Now what you can do, since this is all very simple, but it's also formalized, you can now start proving a couple of theorems about what's going to happen in that pieces of conversation, okay? So in HEM terms, you can write down what potentially can happen. So these are these iterated belief revisions, as it were, okay? But they are not iterated in the sense that one person updates and then she updates again, but it's sort of iterated where you move from agent 1 to agent 2 to agent 1, and then you stop, or the other way around, okay? And what happens is the following. So first of all, after these conversations, you get the AGM postulates again. Okay, fair enough, okay? Then it's a natural end of the game, because if they continue to update, nothing would happen anymore, and that you can prove by AGM. Okay, so it's not just, you know, by fiat I say 1, 2, 1, stop, but at this point, you know, if he was throwing back to her what he's currently believing, nothing would happen anymore. Neither to her, nor to him. Okay, so it's a natural stopping point. If originally they start with mutually consistent unconditional beliefs, okay, then the unconditional beliefs that they have at the end will be the same. So here sort of the ordering doesn't matter anymore, okay? But of course it can also happen that, you know, that you want to have a look at the full disposition, right? And it could also be that they don't overlap, okay, these original belief sets. And what's happened there you can also prove. So what happens is that the belief revision function the ordering of worlds that the agent has after the conversation is a refinement of the original ordering that he had. And it's a lexicographic refinement. Okay? So I'll explain in a second what that means. And similarly the other way around. Okay? So in a picture, so this is just the precise definition, but in the picture it goes like this. You start here, you start there, and what happens is, okay, so the agent 1 would end up with this kind of ranking or preference ordering for worlds. This is the kind of order. And why is that? So these worlds were his most preferred ones, okay? But this one, PQ, she would prefer to this other one, P not Q, okay? So within what was a tie here, okay, the effect of talking to her is that ultimately he prefers that world over that world, and that's that part, okay? And these two were tied for him, okay? But then after having the conversation with her, she prefers that world that's not PQ over that world, which means she's tiebreaker again, and she ends up having the effect that he orders the worlds like this, okay? So that's what's happening, okay? And if it's the other game, sort of where she starts asserting, it's the other way around. Okay? So what happens if agent 1 plays the game in which she asserts sentences first, I mean agent 1, she can in principle refine a conditional belief state to that one. That's the positive effect of conversation, okay? And it's determined by the practical meaning of the sentences, as specified by the rules. Okay. So the remarks on this are, the assertion, why does she assert total conditional belief? Well, you could think of, rather than just, you know, a belief, but it's not maximally specific. Okay? You can think of maybe justified it on broadly Gricean grounds, so it's quality and quantity. Okay? Then you could represent these acts in the object language again. So that's what people like in Amsterdam. Okay? That would be dynamic epistemic logic of a communicative form. Okay? So I don't think people have studied that, but they could. It should be really interesting, I think. I've used the old-fashioned format. Okay? I'm from Munich. Okay? In the game that I've designed, pragmatic meaning is non-compositional, okay? And semantic meaning is presupposed. Okay, so semantic meaning is compositional. Okay? But then you determine the semantic meaning of the assertion as a whole, for example, a supposition of a whole, and then you update on it as a whole. Okay? That was my choice. Okay? You might also think of these beliefs as having action consequences that are of non-linguistic form as a decision theory, sort of. Okay? And you can do that. And if the beliefs of both agents get sufficiently close to the truth or practical success, then modifying them by communication should do so too. Okay, and that's the kind of refinement part that I've mentioned before. Okay, and now let's refine that game. Okay, now let's refine that game. And the way to refine it is use what Vincenzo, for example, would prefer, namely subjective numerical degrees of belief. So I move to subjective probability. Okay. And let's also involve speech check, not just for declarative sentences, but also for non-declarative sentences, like imperatives and questions. Okay? And here, I'll just give you a sketch. Okay? I've put the details there, so if you ask, you can point me to the place that you want to talk about. But I'll just give you the main story. So we beef up the scores. Okay? And they look like this now. So at each score, for each agent, we have a partitioning of possibilities. Okay? That's the question under which the agent currently operates. Okay? And the question semantically is Grunendike's stock of a partition of worlds. Okay? We have the agent's subjective probability measure. We have a set of available actions at the time for the agent. Okay? We have a utility measure or a value function for the agent at the time. So you can see decision theoretic components. That's what I put now into my score. Okay? And then I have certain thresholds. They are going to determine whether the agent is prepared to assert something or not, because this is going to depend how high her corresponding conditional probability or unconditional probability is. Okay? So you need certain components like that. I could also still introduce the common ground. I just leave it out of the picture for simplicity. Okay? And then the idea is they can, again, utter linguistic items, but for example, also now sentences. And I have a semantics of questions in place where the sentence can be a question, and its semantics tells you that this is a partition, okay? And then you can update, in a sense, on the partition, okay? Or they can utter an imperative. There's a semantics for imperative in place, okay? Where the semantic value of the imperative would be maybe a set of actions, okay? To which you want to update, okay? And this is what the rules are going to do for you, okay? So let me just give you an idea. So I have now non-linguistic rules in my game. So that's here, let's look here. So, for example, if an action like H here, okay, maximizes expected utility from the viewpoint of an agent, then the agent is practically permitted to carry out that action. Okay? So sort of standard Bayesian decision theory becomes now part of the non-linguistic rules. Okay? So that's not linguistic, that's just standard decision theory. Okay? There might be more than one action that's practically permissible, because more than one action maximizes expected utility. Fine, then more actions are permitted here. Okay? And so on. Okay? Then you have introduction rules again for assertion of declarative sentences, asking questions, and making suggestions. Okay? And you can change the topic. Okay? Which means basically you're allowed to change the partitioning of possibilities, what you're currently interested in, and so on. Okay? So you can assert, you can ask questions, and you can suggest something. That's, let's do blah blah. That's the imperative. Okay? And all of them come with certain conditions. For example, in order to assert a sentence that expresses a proposition, the proposition must be believed with a degree that's high enough. Yeah? And that's where this threshold, for example, enters the picture. Okay? And so forth. For example, if you ask a question, okay, then the rule would say you're only allowed to do so if the presupposition of the question, that's the union of all the partition cells that are expressed by the question, if that has a high enough probability. Okay? So you're not supposed to ask questions that come with demanding presuppositions that you believe to be false. Okay? And so on and so forth. Okay? And then there are elimination rules. Okay? And these correspond to update operations now on different parts of the score. Okay? So here you now have to update your probability measure, and maybe the partitioning of possibilities that you're currently interested in. Okay? If you're asked a question, you just update the underlying partitioning of possibilities. Okay? And if you get a suggestion, then you might have to shrink the set of available actions for you. Okay? So this is how this works. Okay? If you're interested in how these update operations are defined, ask me later. And there are different options here. Okay? And these options would correspond to different kind of pragmatic meanings that the corresponding speech acts or the sentences involved in the speech acts have. Okay? So this is how this works. Okay? So here's what could be a little conversation again. Okay? So, two people, one asks A, and maybe it's a polar question. Okay? A, question mark? So then the other person eliminates that and updates, okay? So partitioning of possibilities. This also has an effect maybe on the set of actions that are available to her, okay? Sort of she operates now under a new question, and that means certain actions are out because currently they're not relevant to her, okay? Okay, now the second agent does something. Now, given that, she suggests, let's do B, okay? B, okay? And that might be, because maybe the set of available action has been shrunk. It's smaller, and maybe now she's allowed to do that because that action maximizes expected utility. Before there were other actions that would have done the trick, but now this was this change. Okay, the other person, the first one, now eliminates that. Okay, takes that on board. Say what she suggests. Okay, it's really just one action. That's the semantic value of B. So the first agent takes that on board and then acts according to it. Okay, that's conversation. And now you can rationally reconstruct that in that way. Okay? And what might have happened is that originally one might have carried out H by his own choice. Okay? Maybe this was available to him anyway from the start. But what he really wanted to do is he wanted to get the other agent to suggest that he should carry out that action. And that's actually what's going on here. So you can see different paths through the game might lead to the same practical outcomes. Okay? But that's exactly what you would expect in real life as well, even though I sort of artificially designed that game here. Okay? So some remarks, and then I'm done. So we have this reference to an underlying question that the agent has. So this is a bit like Grice's maxim of relation, so relevance. Okay, so there's a relevance aspect here. You could improve on that, like other people, Robert among them has suggested. So even the question, there could be a decision theoretic story about that, and so on. Okay, you can refine the game. You can easily extend the game by rules for speech acts that involve, say, evaluative sentences. Okay. They would track and modify the agent's utility measure. So you need an update on that. Why not? Okay. You could have epistemic modals like we had them before today, and they would track and modify an agent's subjective degrees of belief, right? And you could extend this game by rules for these speech acts involving the sentences, even when they do not even have a semantic meaning. Okay. So the game is general enough that you can also have pragmatic meaning without semantic meaning. Okay? So a classical example would be an indicative conditional more or less according to the Adams-Edgington story. Okay? If you're a suppositionalist about indicative conditionals. Okay? Then you could have an introduction elimination rule for an indicative conditional, and basically you're allowed to assert the conditional if your conditional probability is high enough. Okay? And for the listener, right, for the target, if she takes it on board, then she has to change her degree of beliefs in a way that the corresponding conditional probability gets high enough. Okay? Now the question is how to make it high enough. There are different ways corresponding to different updates, and they would correspond to different pragmatic meanings. Okay? And that can all be in place without indicative conditionals expressing propositions. Okay? As Adams and Edgington would claim, they do not. Okay? So you can see how this works. Okay? You can also, instead of presupposing semantic meaning, determine semantic meaning from pragmatic meaning. Okay? That's another option. Let's design the game for that. So for example, say in your language you have operators like it is permitted that A, it is permitted that A, or it's permissible that A. Okay? So you could have a pragmatic, you want to assign, say, to P of A now a semantic content, a semantic meaning. It's not in place as yet. Okay? But what you have already is, I mean, you can use A to describe actions, and you have A to sort of elicit the action A. Okay? That's already in place, and you have pragmatic meaning for that. And now the idea is, once you have the game in place, let's give that proposition X to P of A, such that updating on the proposition makes the action practical permissible that is described by A and which would be elicited by that. Okay? So the idea is, it is permitted that A, this kind of normative sentence. Okay? Let's think of that as a declarative sentence expressing a proposition. Which one? Well, that proposition such that updating on it, if you asserted it, would have the same practical effect as if you had said do A, right? That's the idea. Okay? So you can move, once you have enough rules in place, you can also cook up semantic meaning from pragmatic meaning in certain cases. Okay? Similarly, maybe for the indicative conditionals, it's just that we know there can't be a perfect match here because of Lewis's triviality results. Okay? But in principle, it's the same idea. Okay? And maybe in this way, you can cook up something like in ingredient sense, okay, in the Dummen sense, where originally you only have esoteric content, and that would be given by pragmatic meaning. Okay? So that's roughly the idea. Okay? For logical operators, you might start with rules on sentences, not propositions. Okay, so that's what the logical differentialist would like. And then you determine the semantic meaning of a logical operator, okay, in the way such that it tracks the original pragmatic meaning where these were rules on sentences, inference rules in the sense of the proof theory. Okay? So all of this can be done with games like that. Okay? Ultimately, the pragmatic meaning of these speech checks may be identified with the set of rules that concern them. Okay? It's a decision theoretic reconstruction of pragmatic meaning, but by that I just mean that the score has these decision theoretic components. It's not that the rules themselves are decision theoretic. Okay? They are linguistic in nature. They have this conventional nature to them. And the idea is that why do we have these additional rules over and above decision theory? Because we need this additional degree of coordination between speakers that decision theory by itself wouldn't give us. Okay? Okay, so conclusion. Let us distinguish conceptually and acknowledge the existence of both semantic and pragmatic meaning. Let's not throw away either of them, okay? And maybe none of them has to be prior, okay? And again, we would first have to specify what kind of priority do we even mean, okay? And there are different ones that we could look at. Once sufficiently formalized and simple enough, we can prove theorems that summarize the potential effects of pragmatic meaning. Think of my little toy example, okay? So then we don't even have to communicate in a sense. You know, if everything is on the table, you know, we can just prove what potentially could happen. So that's nice, okay? But in the more complex games, this won't fly as far as I can see. Even in this decision theoretic game that I had at the end, it becomes very complicated very quickly. So then I think the right way to do it is to implement that and to simulate it, to look at simulations. Okay? Like these days in formal epistemology, people are using simulations in many ways if sort of the pure mathematical treatment becomes too complex. And the same can and should be done here. The rules underlying pragmatic meaning, I think they naturally have a decision theoretic format, but they don't reduce to decision theory. Okay? And we should focus on the interplay between semantic and pragmatic meaning because that might be where the real action is, right? See my final slide on how you can cook up semantic meaning from pragmatic meaning and the other way around. Okay? And I would expect formal semantics and pragmatics in such a sense to join forces in the near future with formal epistemology. And actually we have had an exchange like that, right, between Vincenzo and Robert before. That's exactly formal epistemology meeting formal philosophy of language and semantics. Okay? And final the old notorious realism, anti-realism debates in philosophy. Okay? Whether in the foundations of mathematics or in philosophy of science or in semantics and so on. Maybe they all boil down to debates on semantic versus pragmatic meaning. Okay? And you know, the nice thing is, since I want to keep both on board, you know, neither of them needs to be wrong. And that's nice to say. for an Austrian. Anyway, let me just say, thank you very much.